When Clint Eastwood stepped onto the brightly lit stage of one of America's most watched talk shows, the audience expected just another Hollywood interview. The young, sharp-witted host, Samantha Reed, had built her reputation on dismantling guests with swift jabs and viral gotcha moments. She was sure tonight would be no different, another chance to expose an aging star as out of touch, a relic from another era. But what she didn't realize was that Clint Eastwood wasn't just another guest. And what happened next would go down in history as the Hollywood legend delivered a masterclass in resilience, authenticity, and the power of unshaken truth. The stage was set for a spectacle. The studio lights blazed, illuminating the sleek, modern set. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the center of the stage where something big was about to unfold. At the heart of it all sat Samantha Reed, a young, sharp-dressed, blonde TV host. Infamous for her confrontational interviews, she thrived on making guests uncomfortable, pressing them into corners where their outdated views would be laid bare. The media adored her. She was the rising star of late-night television, a progressive firebrand known for exposing old Hollywood's inability to keep up with modern times. And tonight, her new target was Clint Eastwood. Actor, director, Hollywood icon. A man who had lived through more in a single decade than most would in a lifetime. His career had been built on playing characters who never apologized for who they were. Rugged, tough, direct. To Samantha and her audience, he represented an era long gone, one they believed had no place in today's world. That's exactly why he was here. Network executives had made their expectations clear. They wanted Samantha to expose him, make him look outdated, out of touch, perhaps even controversial. A viral clip of him stumbling through an answer, fumbling for words. That would be the golden ticket. It would generate clicks, retweets, and headlines. But Clint Eastwood hadn't come to play their game. He sat in his chair, comfortably, legs apart, back straight, arms lazily resting on the armrests. No nervous glances, no rehearsed lines. Just a man who had seen it all and wasn't about to be lectured by a young TV host. Samantha adjusted her posture, flashing a polished smile. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned in, charged with anticipation. She had done this many times before. Yet something about the way Clint sat there, calm, steady, eyes sharp as ever, made her uneasy. This wasn't going to go the way she had planned. She crossed her legs, twirling a pen between her fingers. She looked like someone who knew she was in control. Tilting her head slightly, she smirked. Clint, you've built your career on playing the strong, silent type, the rugged man's man, but don't you think that image is, well, outdated? A chuckle rippled through the audience. A few nodded, anticipating Eastwood's slow realization that his time had passed. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Not because he agreed, but because he let the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he leaned in slightly, not aggressive, not defensive, just firm. You mean outdated like telling the truth? Silence. Then, a shift. The chuckles in the audience faltered, some morphing into nervous laughter. Samantha's smirk tightened, her confidence flickering. She hadn't expected him to turn it around on her so quickly. Well, she recovered, keeping her tone light. I just mean, times have changed. The world doesn't run on that old-fashioned tough guy mentality anymore. Clint exhaled, shaking his head slightly, like a man who had heard this all before. Yeah, he said, voice steady, times have changed. But people, he tilted his head, not as much as you think. The audience was silent now, waiting. You think toughness is outdated? He let the question hang in the air. You ever meet a firefighter? His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the room like a blade. A cop? A soldier? He paused. You ever talk to a single mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table? Samantha blinked. She started. Yeah, he interrupted, sitting back, gaze locked onto her. Didn't think so. A few gasps rippled through the audience, a couple of claps. Samantha opened her mouth to take control again, but Clint had already moved on, like a gunfighter who had already drawn first. You can sit here and tell me toughness is outdated, he continued, but the second something goes wrong in your life, the second you're in real trouble. He leaned in, his eyes sharp. You'll be looking for someone like me." The atmosphere in the room changed. Samantha forced another smile, but the audience wasn't laughing at Clint anymore. For the first time, the host wasn't leading the interview. Clint Eastwood was. And he wasn't done yet. Samantha didn't back down. She shifted in her chair, leaning forward, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. Her eyes narrowed slightly. But don't you think masculinity today should be more inclusive? More in touch with emotions?" Clint Eastwood didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders relaxed, locking eyes with her in a gaze so steady, so sure, that the room seemed to hold its breath. You ever seen a firefighter cry about being too tough when they're running into a burning building? There it was. The words landed like a punch, hard. The entire room stiffened. The audience collectively paused, as if trying to absorb the weight of what had just been said. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others slowly nodded, as if recognizing the simplicity and undeniable truth in his words. Samantha blinked. She hadn't expected that. Her confident facade cracked just slightly. "That's not the same thing," she replied, attempting to hold her ground though her voice wavered. Clint didn't budge. "You don't think those guys have emotions?" he asked, his tone still composed yet carrying an unshakable firmness. "But they still go in, they still do the job, no matter what." The crowd sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. There was no quick rebuttal, no sarcastic remark that could undercut the moment. Just a seasoned man speaking an undeniable truth in a way that made it impossible to argue. "You think toughness is a bad thing?" Clint continued, his voice unwavering. "You ever try to push forward when everything is against you? Ever had to stand back up when no one was there to help you?" He let the words settle. "Toughness isn't about being a bully. It's about standing tall when the world is trying to knock you down." Samantha opened her mouth, then closed it. The words weren't there. The audience, once split, was now firmly on Clint's side. She took a deep breath, regaining composure. She still had one card left to play. Shuffling her cue cards slightly, she adjusted her posture, preparing for the final push. "Okay, Clint, but let's talk about your movies. They glorify violence, don't they? Isn't that sending the wrong message to young people? Shouldn't we be teaching them conflict resolution instead?" Clint's lips curled into the faintest smirk. The audience sensed it, a shift in control. He wasn't on defense anymore. Now, he was leading the conversation. "You ever see a movie where the hero saves the day by filing a complaint?" he asked, his voice low, calm, but laced with quiet confidence. The room erupted, laughter rippled through the audience, some even clapped. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Clint wasn't playing by Samantha's rules, he was rewriting them. Her smile tightened. She was losing her grip, and she knew it. He wasn't the man she had prepared to break down. He wasn't stumbling over his words, fumbling for a way out. Clint leaned back, unfazed by the laughter that filled the studio. "Movies are movies," he said with a casual shrug. "It's entertainment, but they also reflect the world we live in." His eyes met hers. "And the world isn't soft, Samantha. It's a tough place, and sometimes you need a little toughness to make it through." The words hung in the air. Samantha tried to steer the conversation back on track, but the crowd's reaction made it clear Clint had shifted the momentum. Her once unshakable confidence was now undeniably in question. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. She straightened in her chair, her polished TV host smile still in place, but something was different now. She wasn't bleeding anymore. Clint was, and the audience felt it too. She needed to regain control, fast. Taking another breath, she switched tactics. "But don't you think old-school toughness has led to toxic masculinity?" she asked, her tone careful, measured. "Wouldn't society be better if men didn't feel the need to be so aggressive?" The audience murmured, sensing the weight of the question. A few heads nodded. This was her chance. If she could push him into a misstep, if she could make him admit that traditional masculinity was outdated, she could reframe the discussion. But Clint Eastwood didn't hesitate. His expression didn't waver. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the chair's armrests, locking eyes with her. Then, In that slow, deliberate tone that made every word land like a hammer, he asked, "Would you say that to a single mother working 2 jobs to put food on the table?" Silence. Not just from Samantha, but from the entire audience. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The energy in the room shifted again. This wasn't about masculinity anymore. This was about resilience, about survival, about real toughness. Clint let the moment breathe, his gaze unwavering. Then he continued, his voice even but firm. "You think toughness is just about throwing punches?" He shook his head slightly. "It's about pushing forward when life gets hard. It's about standing up when no one else will. Take that away from people, tell them it's a bad thing, and what do you have left?" The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. Samantha swallowed. She had prepared for this interview, studied her notes, rehearsed her strategy, but she hadn't prepared for this. And worse, she was losing them. Her smile faded. She shifted in her chair, gripping her cue cards a little tighter. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The audience wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at him. She needed to turn this around, fast. If she couldn't win the argument, she could at least make him look like a relic. Outdated, out of touch. With a careful exhale, she went for it. "You've been accused of being out of touch," she said, tilting her head, her voice carrying a sharper edge now. "Do you think your fans are just people who don't want to accept change?" There it was. They sat up. If she could paint him as a man clinging to the past, as someone irrelevant to modern society, the audience would be reminded that he wasn't someone to take seriously anymore. But Clint just sat there. And then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And in the kind of steady, controlled tone that made the whole world feel like it had just slowed down, he delivered the line that would be replayed across the internet millions of times. "Funny thing about change," he said, his voice as firm as ever. "Not all of its progress." And the crowd erupted. Some clapped, some cheered, others simply nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. Even members of Samantha's own crew exchanged glances. Samantha's smile didn't return. She blinked, searching for the right words to regain control. But how do you argue with that? The shift was undeniable. The audience wasn't waiting for her next question anymore. They were waiting for his next answer. She wasn't leading this interview. He was, and for the first time, she knew it. Samantha's face remained composed, but the cracks were there. The once confident TV host, famous for cutting down guests with sharp questions and progressive talking points, was now struggling to find her footing. She had one last attempt left. Taking a steady breath, she leaned in, softening her tone. If she couldn't outdate Clint, she could at least make him seem cold. Emotionless. Someone who didn't understand the modern world. But don't you think toughness sometimes stops people from showing vulnerability? She asked, her voice edged with just enough sympathy to sway the audience back to her side. "Isn't it okay to admit when we're struggling?" The crowd murmured. It was a smart pivot, one that played well on camera, but Clint Eastwood had seen real struggle, and he wasn't buying it. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly. Then, in that signature gravelly tone, he delivered the final blow. "Toughness is knowing when to fight and when to stand your ground." Silence. He let the words settle before continuing, voice even, but firm. "The world doesn't care about your feelings. It asks if you can handle what's coming." Ooh, that was it. The room erupted. People clapped, some stood, a few let out sharp whistles of approval. Even members of the studio crew, the very people who had expected this interview to go differently, were nodding along. Samantha was frozen, blinking, scrambling for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing left. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood winning an interview. It was about him proving that old-school values, discipline, resilience, strength, weren't outdated. They were essential. And right now the world was eating it up. The tables hadn't just turned. The entire game had changed. The second the cameras cut to commercial, Samantha yanked out her earpiece. Her team rushed toward her, whispering frantic, damage control strategies. But didn't matter, because by the time she even left the stage, the internet had already decided who won. Within minutes, clips of the interview were everywhere. Eastwood School's clueless host, "This is why Hollywood legends still matter." Samantha had thought she was going to win. Big mistake. Hashtags exploded, memes flooded Twitter, YouTube compilations popped up within the hour, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion replays of Clint's final lines. Meanwhile, the network panicked. Producers scrambled to edit the footage before it went online. They called YouTube, issued copyright strikes, tried to push a different narrative. Too late. The clips had already been downloaded and re-uploaded millions of times. And the internet wasn't just watching. They were celebrating. On Reddit, entire threads analyzing the interview racked up thousands of upvotes. On Facebook, older generations applauded Eastwood for standing his ground. Even younger audiences, many who had never even watched an Eastwood film, were commenting. This guy just gets it. Samantha? She stayed quiet. No Twitter posts, no Instagram stories, no clever comebacks. Because no amount of spin could change what had just happened. Clint Eastwood had walked into a modern battlefield, a world built on cancel culture, scripted narratives, and forced talking points. And he had walked out without a scratch. Samantha Reed, on the other hand, nowhere to be found. The morning after the interview, social media was still on fire. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines flashed across every major network. Clint Eastwood shuts down progressive host in viral interview. The moment that ended Samantha Reed's credibility. How a Hollywood legend exposed the media's double standard. And Samantha? Nothing. No tweets, no Instagram posts, no carefully worded reflection statements. Just silence. Her network, scrambling to save face, released a lukewarm, corporate-approved statement. "We at Global Talk believe in fostering conversations that reflect a wide range of perspectives. We appreciate Mr. Eastwood's participation in last night's interview and remain committed to open dialogue." It was the media equivalent of a shrug, and no one bought it. The comment sections under their post were brutal. "This is PR speak for we got wrecked and don't know what to do." At wide range of perspectives. You mean you thought you'd embarrass him and he made you look ridiculous? Clint Eastwood just ended a career without even trying. Samantha's credibility, once untouchable, was now in serious freefall. Her audience, the people who had cheered her on in countless other interviews, weren't defending her this time. Some tried to spin it. They called the interview a calculated ambush. Others claimed Clint's fans were just nostalgic for a time that never really existed. But the damage was already done. The truth was, Samantha hadn't just lost a debate. She had lost the room. She had walked into that interview expecting to corner a Hollywood legend, to make him look outdated, irrelevant, a relic of the past. But Clint, he never played the game, and that's why he won. Days later, the hype should have died down, but it didn't, because the internet wasn't done talking about Clint Eastwood. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It had become a moment, a rare instance where someone, without a script, without media training, without an agenda, stood firm in what he believed, and let the world decide. And people were still deciding. Then it happened. A paparazzi clip. Nothing fancy, just a shaky camera and a TMZ logo in the corner. The video surfaced on social media. Clint Eastwood walking out of a steakhouse in Los Angeles. A young reporter rushed up, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, did you expect your interview to go so viral?" Clint paused mid-step. He turned his head slightly, gave the reporter a look, one of those classic Clint Eastwood looks, the kind that could make a man rethink his entire life. Then he chuckled, shrugged. "Didn't expect anything," he said, voice calm as ever. "Just said what I meant. That's rare these days." And just like that, the internet exploded all over again. The video spread across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It didn't matter where you looked, Clint's words were everywhere. People took those 9 words and turned them into memes, motivational quotes, reaction videos. "Just said what I meant," That's rare these days. It was simple, it was true, and it hit harder than any speech ever could. Meanwhile, Samantha Reed, still silent, because what could she say? No carefully worded response, no damage control statement, no think piece from a media ally could undo what had already happened. Clint Eastwood hadn't just won a debate. He had reminded people of something they had forgotten. Real strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need approval. It just needs to be real. And that's why people still listen to Clint Eastwood, even now. This story was brutal. But the story on the right, that one's even crazier.